So, accessibility features play a very important role when you're designing forms for the internet. And with HTML5, we've got semantic elements that can help with that quite a bit. We have, and we'll discuss these in greater depth, but we have label, field set, and legend. And if we go back to our two examples that we picked up first from the book and then from Netlify, we can see that um, in the first example, we actually have a field set, which is the default styling for that is to create a box. And then inside, sort of inside that border, that, that box, is a legend. And then down here inside the form itself are labels attached to these inputs. Now, the Netlify example is not using field set and legend, but it has labels. And there are two different ways of doing labels, and we'll see that discussed in the book. But the important thing about labels is not only visually does it attach something meaningful to that input box, but the way that we implement labels, we're able to actually create something called the target, whereas if we come out here and hover over the label and click on it, the focus changes to that box. So instead of having just something like a paragraph with the words your name, by actually making that a label and somehow associating that label with this input box, we're able to make larger targets. And that becomes very important for mobile devices where we have fingers that are having to get pressed on top of something so that you can go in there and type into that input box. So again, that's what she is mentioning here. It provides obviously a label for the input box and allows for our screen readers and things like that to be able to associate those labels with those input boxes. The problem, in my opinion, the problem that we have with labels is that we can have either implicit labels or explicit labels. And so if we go into the code, we can actually see those two things working. Again, her example is a little bit more accessible, and it uses explicit labels using the for attribute. And this is actually the first time we will see a proper use of an ID inside an element or the element's tag. And as we find out from our reading for explicit labels, that for in the label matches an ID in the input box or whatever form control you're putting a label on. So now if I just copy this, copy this. It's not letting me copy. Let me use my fingers, Command C, and I'll throw it in here somewhere. I'm getting these interesting extra characters. Don't know what those are. Format document with Beautify. Save that. So we'll notice in our own code that that we're using explicit labels. I prefer explicit labels. The way to tell the difference, obviously, is you do not have the for attribute inside your label tag. To make it implicit, you have to put the form control inside the label. You'll notice on this one, you have an open label tag. Then we have the actual words for the label, the form control, and then the close. So as I say, I find that unfortunate. I wish we only had one and not two ways of creating labels, but we're going to use explicit association. Field sets and legends not only provide us some nice visual grouping of form controls, but they also work helping out the screen readers in being able to tell a visitor using a screen reader that these elements are grouped together. These form controls are grouped together. They have some logical grouping associated with them. Let's see, that might be everything in this chapter. Yes, that's everything in this chapter that I wanted to point out in terms of Project 6. So again, if we look at this, now that you know what a field set and a legend are, we have a field set in here. We actually have two. The field set with a legend that says contact form. And if you'll notice, we have another field set down here with a legend, would you like a reply? Which is a very nice use and very common use of grouping radio buttons together, because visually and especially in a screen reader, without this grouping, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious that we have a group of radio buttons or a group of check boxes if we're not including these. So these are very important for the reasons of accessibility.